I am going to introduce our guest here in just a minute, but first I want to welcome you to our SKP Camp community. That's who is sponsoring this evening. And we just are glad that you're with us and you have given up an important hour of your evening to see what this is all about, meet a group of guys who I believe love Jesus and love helping others. And so our camp, SKP Camp, is a camp that's been going on now for 6 years. This will be our sixth year. And we're very, very excited about it. It's a weekend camp. Starts on a Friday night, ends on a Sunday noon. And we are in Winter Park, Colorado, a couple of hours from the airport if you're flying in. And what we do with that camp is we have adventures with fathers and sons, mentors and mentees, with the idea of helping them grow deeper in their friendship with one another, with God, and the outdoors. And we have a board of about 11 people who help us make good decisions. We're a 501c3. We have 4 years of adventures, and this is our second year in the cycle. And the second year is an automotive skills camp. And our theme for this year is what gets your motor running. And there is a spiritual side to this piece, not just working on cars, although you will leave having learned how to do an oil change and a tune up and with the help of some really good mechanics. But the spiritual side of this is going to be how to maintain the brain. If you're going to maintain an engine, great. How about learning how to maintain the brain at the same time? And we've invited a real special guest to be with us. His name is David Bruce. He's a brother from the Los Angeles International Church of Christ. He's a counselor out there. He's in ministry, and he may add a few more bullet points to that. But anyway, super grateful to have him. We met each other when I lived in Los Angeles, and he grew up in Oklahoma. I think your father was a pastor. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yep.
Yep.
And funny enough, David himself did not decide to follow Jesus until he moved out of the country. He went to Moscow, for goodness sakes. And that's where he found somebody to tell him about Jesus. Couldn't find one in Oklahoma.
That's right. Bible Belt wasn't big enough.
And there's a similar story that we share. I grew up south of Dallas. I went to a school called Abilene Christian. I went to Costa Rica as a missionary, and I found out while I was in Costa Rica as a missionary that I didn't know much about Jesus either. And so I got baptized in Costa Rica myself. So it took us both to leave the country to figure out what this is about. So that's a kind of a fun little common story there that we have. But David is married to Cece. He met her in Stockholm. They've been married, I think, for 30 years. Is that right, David?
Yep.
Got
30.
that going. And then two kiddos. And anyway, just has a wonderful story about how he's come to be a counselor. You are welcome to step into that yourself there, David. But here's a question that may be yours. If not yours, perhaps somebody who you're mentoring, maybe your own
Mhm.
son. You find that there's an issue with pornography or with alcohol or with drugs or with gambling, or you fill in the blank. And our normal way to deal with such an issue is to put you in some sort of accountability group and work you over, you know, just work you hard. And in talking with David here over the last couple of years, he believes there's another way to help people. And it's starting with knowing how God created your brain. And so, David, I'll let you take it over from there. Go ahead and complete whatever introduction you'd like to. But that's the scenario that's presented to us. Wonder if knowing more about the brain tonight could be a help. What do you think, David?
I think it could. I think it could. At least that's my experience for a number of years now. before I get into any of that, I want to back up a little bit and just tell you all how really honored and envious I am of this group. So I have two kids. My oldest is my son Michael. He's 28, and my daughter, who's married, is 25 and just had her first kid. So I'm a proud grandpa these days, loving that. But I just remember when I was raising my son, Michael, when he was approaching adolescence and all the issues with puberty that came up with that, all the social things going on at school and stuff like that. It's interesting, but I was just scrambling with just a couple of friends of mine about how to do this whole fathering sons thing. And, I did some weird experiments, going out camping and try to do my own kind of form of ritual that we read about somewhere. But I think the thing I was missing is I did not have access to a community of men that were all devoted and just ready to get on board to do this together as a community. So I think when Bart first mentioned your camp and just described the purpose of it and the intention of it, um, I got to be honest. I was happy and sad at the same time. Really happy for you, but just thinking, gosh, if I'd had this type of community of men to gather with, to learn with, um, and navigate this, because I think it's one of the most important things we can do before we leave this world is to leave it with young men that we've loved and believed in, to allow, God to continue doing his work. Not maybe through us, but through the people that we are influencing today in this life. So anyway, I just want to applaud all of you, first of all, for just being a part of this and consider yourselves, I think, blessed, even if you haven't been on this camp yet. But I think just leaning into it and wanting to go is already a huge deposit. Um, so that's my first thing I want to share. And yeah, I think first of all, I got to say I was so intimidated when Bart mentioned the theme of this camp being about auto repair because I'm probably the most incompetent guy in LA in terms of taking care of a car. I love Jiffy Lube, and whenever I got to have that thing done on my car, I let somebody else do it. So hopefully, Bart, if it's okay, someone could, mentor me at this camp and help me learn some of these things while I'm
Absolutely.
there. That'll be great. Okay, perfect, perfect. So anyway, but I do know a little bit about what's under this hood, which is the brain. And I became a marriage and family therapist about 20 years ago. And what's interesting is I first got into counseling because of my own personal addiction issues. I had an issue with pornography and masturbation all of my life, ever since I was a kid. That was one very, very strong coping mechanism that I had throughout adolescence. I was a only child, sort of in the presence of my parents' very, very slowly degrading marriage that ultimately ended in divorce when I was in college. And so, yeah, I mean, impurity was just, it was a daily thing. And what was interesting was, as Bart mentioned, I got reached out to when I was in college. No, after I finished college, when I moved to Moscow, I'd actually been studying Russian for about 2 or 3 years when I was going to the University of Oklahoma. And actually, it was reading Russian literature that kind of restored my faith because for many years, my dad, after he got out of the ministry, I was 5 years old when he got out of the ministry. And after about a year, my parents and I never stepped into a church again. So what was really bizarre is I still have these memories of my dad, behind a pulpit, being this man of faith, this man that everyone really admired and looked up to. And then boom, it's gone. There was never discussion of it again. A few times I begged my parents, could we go to church sometime? And, I might be interested, but it just never, ever worked out. So by the time I got to college, I'm still kind of, on my own little thing, doing probably, I was a little bit agnostic, I would say. But Russian literature is what brought my faith back. reading guys like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. These men just like blew my mind, helped me understand that it makes perfect sense to have faith in God, makes perfect sense to trust and work with the Bible and how it can impact your life. And so, yeah, God was really setting me up for this moment in Moscow in 91 when I was living there by myself. And this brother came up to me on the street, invited me to church. And then the next week, I came to my first midweek of the Moscow Church of Christ. Didn't know what I was walking into. First of all, I was very taken aback. Like, why are people so happy and why are people so enthusiastic about being at church? Because I'd been to Church of Christ churches before in my wandering years, and I never saw that much energy and enthusiasm. It was really bizarre. But anyway, these two Russian guys came up to me and asked if I'd like to study the Bible. And in my American humility, of course, I thought, well, since we live in the Soviet Union at this time in 91, it was still the Soviet Union, surely they're asking me to help them with the Bible because I'm from America. I'm sure I know the Bible better than these guys, right? So anyway, so the next day we met and did the whole Russian tea thing and sharing our stories. And as these guys were talking about their lives, I was just like, okay, what these guys were describing, I've been looking for about 4 years and cannot figure it out. So they studied the Bible with me, and about a week later, I got baptized in December of 1991. And and then the miracle happened. I got baptized and I had no issues with impurity. I was healed. Everything was great for about 3 years. And 3 years later, you know, stuff started coming into Russia, like Western media and stuff like that. And then the internet came in. And after 3.5 years of really just no issues whatsoever, suddenly I just started falling into that temptation over and over and over again. And at some point, I would say my pornography use and practice was probably worse than it was before I became a Christian. So you can imagine I was just like utterly depressed. I mean, I didn't know what to do. I kept confessing wasn't working. And ultimately, in 2000, I ended up moving to Los Angeles. My job had changed in Moscow, and I ended up having a job transfer to LA. And in Los Angeles is when I first got introduced to a recovery ministry. It was actually the first men's purity group in LA. And I joined that group. And what I learned there, I told Bart and others, what I learned in that recovery circle, it was like a second conversion. It was like, okay, here's this whole different way of understanding myself, understanding God and his relationship with me, what he thinks about me, what he thinks about sin. It was just life changing. And in all that, a few years later, well, I went back to school to get a degree in counseling because I was so transformed by that experience. I wanted to do recovery work for the rest of my life. And so I got a degree in counseling. And then after I graduated from college, or got my master's in psychology, um, I just started doing my own brain research and trying to learn how the brain works and how it connects to all these things you're trying to do in counseling. And yeah, that's kind of what I am. Sort of at my clinic, I'm called the brain guy because I usually can't have a session with someone without talking about something about how the brain works. And my motto is, if you know how something works, you will use it better. I think that applies to vehicles and cars. It also applies to the brain. And I think if fathers and sons at the same time can have kind of a shared understanding of how the brain works, I think it will introduce a whole different way of how we talk about things, how we strategize about things. Because I think before I learned about the brain, I always thought sin had to do with
Up, up.
willpower and trying harder, that kind of stuff. So, yeah, so I think the brain is a really important thing to understand. It's something I look forward to getting into at this camp and just kind of breaking down some of the basics. And yeah, I think that's about it.
Great. Appreciate that comment. Let me just ask you this, since we're either mentors or fathers or just guys with our own issues. Let me take you back to just a young brain. What does a young brain need to flourish, to do well, to not, you know, step into these traps that are there for us? What do you think?
Um, well, the developing, well, actually, if it's okay, can I share my screen?
Sure. Let's see. I'm sure you can. Let's see if I can figure that out.
Ooh, I have to see.
Booyah. Let's see if you can try that.
Ah, there we go. Thank you. Okay, here we go. It helps if I kind of show a picture here.
There you
Can you
go.
guys see this?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the brain. The two basic areas of the brain that I try to teach anyone that I'm counseling or uh, pretty much any guy in a Bible study with me is going to get a little brain lecture at some point. But the two areas of the brain that I think are so important and critical to understand, and I'm going to get to your question, Bart, I
Yeah.
promise. Okay, so
Mm.
this is the brain in general. Forget how old it is, but let's just say, let's talk about our brains right now. We, right there in the middle of the brain, kind of around that red circle, there's a whole cluster of structures right above that red circle called the limbic system. And the limbic system is where we see all these very, very specific functions. So all of the human emotions, doesn't matter which one, mad, glad, sad, or scared, all of those emotions originate from neurochemistry released from within the limbic system. And then from there, you have all these different signals that are formed where you start feeling things maybe in your chest, or you'll feel, tears in your eyes or something like that. All these different processes happen from that neurochemistry released in the limbic system. Okay, so all the emotions start there. Next is the reward center, and that's what we call your dopamine headquarters. And dopamine is a really wonderful neurotransmitter created by God. However, it also has a really bad reputation because dopamine is also the root of all chemical and behavioral addictions. Okay. So the pure intention of dopamine, at least my theory on it, if God created it, it must have a good purpose and reason. Dopamine is usually associated with healthy things like learning and motivation. Okay. So think about you're at your job and you've been working on a problem at your job for a few hours, and then you finally solve it. You finally figured out all the nuances that, needed to solve that problem. That feeling you get when you solve something or complete something, that is God blessing you with a little dose of dopamine. Okay. When you solve things, you feels so good, you probably want to do it again. And that's why you still have a job because you keep solving things and figuring things out and getting things done. Dopamine is all connected to that. The problem, though, is we can do things that can actually overactivate that dopamine headquarters, like things like alcohol, marijuana, drugs, um, gambling. You can involve in these activities that will give you this huge amount of dopamine. But for doing what? Nothing
Well,
more than putting something outside of your body in it or involving a behavior that's not really solving anything and not teaching you anything, right? So that's a big deal, understanding that. Next is relationships. If you're around, and this is starting to get to Bart's question, when you're around relationships that are very, very healthy, affirming, um, not soft, challenging, but still for you, your limbic system is doing it will function more well when it's around good relationships. If you're around unpredictable, hurtful, or shaming relationships, your limbic system will not function as well and it will prematurely age. And we just don't do well in bad community. That's where that verse in Second Corinthians about bad company corrupts character. My neurological spin on that is bad company actually corrupts your limbic system. But the opposite is true. Good company actually improves your limbic system. It actually restores it and helps it. So relationships and the type of relationships that we have are really, really important. And then we have memory, or your long-term memory is stored in the limbic system. So any memory that you have access to, whether it was a year ago or 20 years ago, you can thank your limbic system for storing that for you. Okay. And then finally, safety, that little red circle that I was talking about earlier, that is a little structure called the amygdala. And that is where you have that thing, that response you've all heard about, the fight or flight response. Basically, that little nugget is asking, am I safe? If it says yes, the brain will function normally. If it says no to any form of lack of safety, okay, then that amygdala starts warming up and we start having difficulties, which we're going to look at in a second. Now, if we go to the front part of the brain, that red area is what we call the prefrontal cortex. That is what we say is probably the more complex functions of the brain. So, judgment, decision making, impulse control, planning, strategizing. And then in the last 20 years, we've been learning that people that practice spiritual things like prayer, meditation, meditating on spiritual texts, things like that, really intentionally, what they see in brain scans now is when people engage those activities, prefrontal cortex activity goes up a little and limbic system activity goes down a little. And that's actually kind of the perfect balance. You always want the prefrontal cortex working with the limbic system, but staying a little bit ahead of it. Okay. So now I'm about to explain even more about Bart's question. That was a very important one. What about young boys and young brains? Well, the big thing you got to know about your kid, if he's under the age of 25, that prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop. So if you think about that, when your kid was 10, I guarantee you just about every function in the limbic system, he had it 100%. It's there. But how was your 10-year-old son's decision making? Probably needed a little help from dad, or maybe needed his teacher to remind him sometimes of some stuff. That prefrontal cortex is so slow to develop. um, that's where most parents start to lose their minds with adolescence, is because an adolescent feels like an adult, right? I'm 14, I know how I feel, I know what I like and all that good stuff. But they don't understand that that prefrontal cortex isn't quite developed, and so they think that they're an adult and they'll try to act like an adult. But guess what? They're still at 14 making the weirdest, strangest decisions that you can't understand. And you think it's a relational problem, and that's part of it, but part of it is a neurological problem. That kid is not fully developed yet, right? And he doesn't know that. That's why he's got to have good relationships with him, around him, to help him, borrow some of the prefrontal cortex of dad and mentors, but also mentors that allow that kid to experiment and make some of those decisions himself. Okay, so it's not parents and dads taking over and saying, okay, that's it, kid. I'm going to be your prefrontal cortex. When you do that, you're actually hindering the development of your son's prefrontal cortex. And I've seen this. I know guys that are 22 years old, 23 years old, and because mom and dad have made so many of their decisions, they don't know really how to function like an adult because they've never been allowed to practice using that prefrontal cortex. Okay. So the last thing I want to say before my brain lecture ends, I apologize if this is going longer than we thought, but the other thing is the brain only has a certain amount of energy at one time. So when the limbic system gets hot, so for example, you as men, if you think about what's the last time you felt really, really angry about something, okay? If you just think about that, when you're really, really angry, first of all, which area of the brain was hot when you were really angry?
Limbic.
Thank you. Limbic system, right? Because it's an emotion, right? So keep that picture in your mind when you're really, really angry. And now, in your own mind, answer the following questions. In that situation, how was your judgment? How is your decision making? Impulse control? How is your planning? Maybe a little sinister, maybe a little evil. How is your strategizing? You know, in spirituality, well, maybe that was the next day or something when you started regretting what you did when you were angry. You get my point. When the limbic system is hot, it doesn't matter if you're 25 or 55. If your limbic system is too hot, you will lose access to your own developed prefrontal cortex. So this is where dads have to make sure they're doing things that keep their brains really balanced and connected, right? And I've already talked about, things like prayer and meditation and having a good spiritual life. That's a first big deposit you can make. But think about what I just said about that little experiment with anger. It's the same thing with pornography. When you act out or look at pornography, you are strongly activating that reward center in the limbic system, right? And as we engage in those types of activities, it actually hinders your own access to that prefrontal cortex, where you can make really good choices, better choices in navigating things. So, um, Bart, if you don't mind, I know you're going to talk a little bit about initiation
Yeah.
rites and stuff like that. If it's okay, I want to share a couple more things here. One of my big mentors in this area that Bart is doing with this camp, Richard Rohr, is one of my favorite spiritual thinkers, if you will. But he said, suffering reminds us of our lack of control and forces us to trust in something bigger than ourselves. So here's a question. When you are suffering, when you are experiencing discomfort, which area of the brain would you say is active or getting overactive?
Limbic.
Limbic. And to be real specific, it would be the amygdala within the limbic system. Because guess what? Suffering creates very strong reactions, right? So if we as men are not learning how to suffer well and suffer wisely and how to navigate that, right? We are not going to be able to help our young sons learn that earlier in life. We have to learn to have a relationship with difficulty. Okay. So Richard Rohr, he wrote a book about, he actually studied male initiation rituals all over the globe in all kinds of cultures, both Christian and non-Christian. And after reviewing all these different cultures and different processes of how men initiated young men, he found there were 5 things that were relevant, that were showing up in all these initiation rituals, regardless of what part of the world. Okay, and here they are. Number 1, male initiations taught that life is hard. Okay, can I hear an amen on that?
Amen.
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 All right, yeah, I'm hoping to get a little more enthusiasm, but anyway, but life is hard. Okay. Number 2, you are not that important. Okay. Now that's not talking about shame. Like, you need to feel horrible about yourself. No, it doesn't mean think less of yourself. It just means thinking about yourself less. Okay. You are not that important. 3, your life is not about you. Wow. I don't know, guys. I'm starting to think about Jesus here at this point. Okay, this is very in line with what Jesus came to teach humanity. But anyway, 4th one, you are not in control. Right? Have you ever noticed that when you try to get control over things outside of your control, what that feels like? It's called a limbic system storm because it's so frustrating and your prefrontal cortex can't do anything, can't make any decisions because there's so many situations that we don't have control in, right? And here's the big one. You ready for the last one, guys?
Oh, yeah.
Here we go. You're going to die. Wow. So here we go. Here's men telling these young men, trying to introduce them to manhood. And these are the 5 principles that they're teaching them. Okay. Now, what I liked about this list is it taught me something very important about addiction and about pornography. When men or young men are exposed to pornography, it debunks all of these. Life should not be hard. It needs to be fun and pleasurable. I am pretty important, right? Regardless of what this is implying to other people's lives or these women that are involved in this industry and all the pain and suffering involved in it, that's not important, but I'm important. And in that moment, when I was involved in pornography, in those moments, my life is all about me. It's about what I am trying not to feel by engaging in something outside of myself. And then guess what? I'm in full control. I can click what I want to click. I can watch as much as I want. And I've been down that road where it just keeps spiraling. And then in a moment there, I'm kind of forgetting the whole reality
Berna,
that, at some point I'm going to
Berna,
die. I'm not even
can you
connected to
bring
that,
me a pen?
you
I
know?
don't know what happened to mine.
So anyway, but I don't know if you can mute people, but
Yeah.
anyway, so I think, oh, and then here's my last thing here. One of my favorite guys, Mr. Rogers,
I
who
can't see where if it
some of
fell. I don't
you
see where it
may
fell.
be too young to know who this guy was, but he said some pretty remarkable thing here. He said emotions that are mentionable are manageable. So this goes back to Bart's question. If a young boy can feel secure enough and safe enough to mention to his dad whatever emotion he's feeling, whether it's anger, fear, sad, it doesn't matter. If that kid can mention what he feels to safe men in his life, especially dad, that is how a young man develops security.
Mm.
Okay. Because when we feel what we feel and we can't let it out, it starts to get distorted. And then I'm really, really angry about something, but because I can't talk about it, instead of dealing and learning how to cope with that, I switch to dopamine and I look at a lot of pornography or I drink a lot of alcohol, right? And that's how this whole thing is kind of connected. We've got to have safe outlets to talk about what we feel. So before I finish here, last thing I want to share is this app. This is a app called How We Feel. And I think if you scan that barcode, it should open up the app on your phone. But this is an app designed by the Yale Institute for Emotional Intelligence. And I'm telling you, it is a brilliantly laid out platform of how you as dads and men can actually kind of find and see what type of feeling I'm feeling in any given particular situation. Okay. And half the time, that's why some of us as men are not good at this because we weren't around a lot of people that mentioned how they felt about things, right? I was around some people growing up that inflicted how they felt, but they didn't mention and talk about how they felt, and that's a big difference. So this app, I actually every client that I work with, I recommend this app in our first appointment. Before we see each other again, I hope you download this app, look through it. There's a few good, easy tutorials in it that can teach you some things about emotions, but it is a brilliant resource that I hope you guys can check out. And with that, I'm
Amazing.
going to stop.
Great, great stuff, David. Thank you so much. Lots to go through here. Guys, I'm going to give you the next 20 or so minutes to come and share your thought or ask a question. And I'll turn off the recording device so that we can just be real men here. But yeah, I just wanted to underline before we do that this is sort of the environment that we're trying to build with the SKP camp. And that is a very safe environment, non-judgmental environment. We all have things, but to white knuckle yourself and try to overcome those things is not a good plan. But to have people who can say, yep, I'm going through the same stuff, and together we're going to link arms, and we're going to be the men that we need to be. And you may have been a part of other accountability groups or whatever groups that were harsh and may have trauma, honestly, when you think about, oh, gee, here's another group or whatever. But I'm a real advocate of having just two or three guys that you can meet with on a regular basis, and no one's the leader. You're grabbing a coffee or a beer or wherever, and just trying to process life together and pray for each other. Pretty simple stuff. Matthew 18:20 talks about where there are two or three gathered in my name, there I am. And it's really made a difference in my life, to be honest with you. And I know those kinds of groups have made a difference in David's life and others that are on the phone call here.
Yeah.
I want to underline our camp. It's going to be July 25th through 27th in Winter Park here in Colorado. For those that are outside of Denver, that's about a 2-hour drive. We'll figure out ways to get you from the airport out there. It's a weekend. We can get you back at work on Monday morning. It's $200 a piece, but guess what? For those that can afford that, we have scholarships available. You just got to find your way up here, and we'll take care of you. And it's a hot time of the year for everybody, but come to Colorado and we'll find some cool for you to enjoy, a little bit of coolness in the mountains. And yeah, we really feel like we've got something here that's valuable, important. The whole story of fatherlessness in our country is quite the epidemic. And we believe that the way to help that story is to make sure that we have deep and meaningful friendships with our sons as well as our mentors, mentees. And so we learn these skills like automotive, and we turn around and work on our own cars together. And also we find that single mother down the road who we could reach out to and serve together. What a deal. So that's our story on the camp. You have our website, skpcamp.com, and we are asking you to show up, even if you don't have a son or mentee. There's a community being formed here that I think is of great value. So I'll get off that and open it up here. You're welcome to unmute yourself. We're going to give it to you. What questions, what comments? We've all had struggles. And David is going to do a 2-part series. This is part 1. The second part is on the 16th of this month. That's a Monday night. Again, 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And he'll give us a challenge here by the end of the call. And we'll have all of us consider what we can do between now and the 16th to really take our story, our fights to the next level. But for now, let me just go ahead and open it up. Anybody's welcome to make a comment or a question.
Sure. I have a comment. And hi, Dave. Thank you so much for all your awesome help as always. Heard you speak several times. Love it. Love all your content. Just as a dad of 2 teens, I've got a 16, soon to be 17, and soon to be 19. Great kids. Love them to death. I know at that age you can't, just be so, don't do this, and just
Right.
I would love your guidance, and just when there's something I absolutely do not agree, just how to guide them and help them to think for themselves, but without being so controlling or so just they're not 5 years old anymore. So
Darn it.
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyhow, just that sort of topic there. That's but for the most part, they're. I mean, they make great decisions. But sometimes I'm like, I
I hear you. I hear
have
you,
to
bro.
watch and
Anyone, share with anyone anything that made sense tonight. Again, whenever you actually process and explain to someone else something you've just learned, it sticks. There's a sticky aspect to that helps it stick. The third request I would have, if all of you have access to Bart Moyer's email address, it would help me so much if you had any questions that came up after tonight or before our next appointment, if you could forward any questions to Bart, and that way I could be a little more even more specifically equipped with things that you guys may want to clarify, or even just things you hope we do talk about at the camp. I would love to know some of those things. So if you could forward those things to Bart, that would be great.
Very good.
I hope that's okay, Bart. I just
Perfect. David,
Only-
thanks for your
only told
time.
you.
Guys, thanks for giving up an hour. I think it's been rich, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys here real soon. Have a great night.
Awesome. All
Thank
right,
you,
thank you
David.
guys.
Thanks, Bart.
Thanks,
You guys.
David.
Thank you.
Love you.
Bye.
Bye
Bye
bye.
now.